Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we have another long-awaited episode of The Trailing Edge for the second quarter of 2019, where I cover a couple albums for which I just don't have enough material to flesh out a full review. In this case, a couple albums that on average were close to greatness, but didn't quite get there for me, which is why I'm covering them here. And a fair few of them which I was planning a full review, and then I just ran out of gas, didn't have enough to say. I will say this second quarter was better than the first, and a fair few less disappointments, which was absolutely worthwhile talking about. Let's not waste any more time, though, and get into
God and country music. God and country music.
Okay, look, I've got a bit of a complicated relationship with George Strait and a lot of his music. Because again, like with Reba, I grew up on George Strait music. But specifically, I grew up on singles compilations and greatest hits. Because like a lot of acts that came out of that era in the mainstream in Nashville, George Strait wasn't really known as an album artist. I mean, going back to him now as a critic, I can say that still. The albums are always kind of spotty, hit and miss. They're defined by the great number of songs that you would get to flesh out a full album, but I'd rarely say he's got true classics under his belt the way you would classify other albums. And that's kind of the same thing I feel about this new project he's put out. It's certainly good, there are some standout cuts that I certainly respect, but it also runs a little long, it's got more dead zones than I'd prefer, it's very neo-traditional, very country in that line. Anybody who's looking for George Strait to put out more music like that, you've got it. But I guess once you get past that, I'm not seeing the elements that go above and beyond. And I draw the comparison to Reba's recent comeback album because it's kind of prevalent. They're both artists that came out of a similar era, but Reba has shown a little bit more of a desire to look forward and let her material age with her. Not to make it more contemporary one way or the other, but it does feel a little bit more comfortable with her in that lane. Whereas George Strait, it's almost as if you could have released that album coming out of the 90s and nothing would have really changed about it. And sure, that will satisfy a lot of die-hard fans, but it also doesn't stand out the way it should, and the sequencing's kind of all over the place, and the drums are mixed too high for no good reason. I also feel I would be doing a disservice if I didn't mention the song The Weight of the Badge, which is very much a song in favor of, or more in terms of respecting the police that you get from George Strait. I'm not surprised it's here. People tend to forget that country does have a pretty significant conservative streak, and this could have very quickly wound up being kind of ugly, but I don't think the song falls in that lane. I think it's heavy-handed, but it's never in a way where it's bad or reinforcing a jingoistic element. It's more about just respecting officers of the peace. And if the police didn't have so many of the negative connotations they do in popular society now, the song probably wouldn't be controversial. I don't think the song is even that controversial. It's kind of harmless and benign, an album cut that's going to be forgotten by anybody except the people going to a George Strait album. And let's be honest, there aren't that many die-hard liberals or people further to the left who are going to pick up a late period George Strait album. And even if they are, they're not going to be surprised by this song. So as it is, look, I can't say it's bad. It's a good album. It's a neo-traditional country album. I'll freely admit that I'm a little bit biased on this because, again, I did grow up with this music. But at the same time, it's not great in the same way that Reba's album is. It's a little bit listless. It runs long. The sequencing's not good. I think there are fewer standout cuts, although there are definitely a few of them. God and Country Music is one of those songs that actually does shoot a little higher and sticks the landing. And there's a few others scattered around the album. But overall, I didn't feel really the need to go into full depth surrounding this in a review, mostly because, at the end of the day, if you know George Strait, you know exactly what you're getting here. So I'm thinking, light 7 out of 10. For the fans, you've already heard this. For everyone else, honestly, it's not going to change your mind one way or the other surrounding George Strait, so make of that what you will.
This is hip hop. I don't give a fuck about your wristwatch. Waves in my hair, flow water, no drip drop. Rhymes tip top. I do this for hip hop. Life's a beach, give a fuck about your flip flops.
So many longtime viewers are probably a little bit confused why this is not getting a full-length proper review like I've done for Brazy Da Bo before, given that he's one of those underground rappers I have been covering since 2015. I've reviewed a lot of his projects. I think the guy's got a lot of potential, which is one reason why I have been as supportive as I have. The guy's got really good taste for production. Occasionally he can structure some really good flows. In terms of his overall rhyme structure, yeah, it's not incredibly complex, but it gets the job done, and I'm normally pretty impressed with some of the wordplay that he structures together. But with this album, I feel like we've hit a bit of a ceiling, and I'm not sure how he gets past this. Yeah, the production and the good taste he has there, it's as good as ever. It's smooth, it's liquid, it's melodic, it flatters him. And yeah, he can occasionally structure an okay hook. But the flows haven't really evolved over the course of the past couple of years, and more to the point, I'm running into the issue where the content just isn't as interesting as it really needs to be. He's good in structuring some of the internal wordplay, but if the songs don't add up to much more and he just plainly starts repeating himself as he does in a couple songs here, I'm just not going to be as interested, especially as, again, I've heard some of this before. It's not bad by any means. I'm still giving this a strong 6 out of 10, but it's not an essential listen from him in the same way that Perfection was. So, just take that as you will. Hope things recover and get a little bit more interesting and diverse next time.
On yourself. Yeah. Make it easy on yourself.
So this is definitely one of those projects I wanted to discuss a little bit more in detail, again, in a full review, but the funny thing is that I've heard a lot of acts like Awon, and I want to establish what my general issue is with this sort of sound, this sort of presentation. Because he's a good rapper. He flows well. I think a lot of his command of the beat is actually pretty good. He's got phenomenal taste in production. I really like that old school, scratchy soul sample accent and boom bap. That's entirely up my alley. And there are moments of genuine introspection, questioning his jealousy at not blowing up earlier and trying to get a little bit more introspective that I do appreciate. And sadly, that's about as much as I can really say about the guy. A lot of rappers in his lane, specifically that are just adjacent to the mainstream, that are trying to be a little bit more lyrical and introspective, they miss some of that a little bit greater detail that would come in the songwriting, a little bit more flair in the poetry that I think would put them over the top, or production that takes a little bit more of a risk, or slightly stronger or more refined hooks. And I'll admit that while calling out some of the hypocrisy does tend to be a strength of Awon's, especially in some of the more introspective moments here, there are a fair few songs where he'll still find time to indulge and give himself a pass, where on other points of the album that he wouldn't. It's inconsistent and it kind of feels oddly structured in its flow, and that it doesn't really come to a head throughout the course of the arc. The album meanders, and not exactly in a good way. On a whole though, I hear a lot of rappers like this in this lane. I put Brazy Da Bo in a similar lane in that their voice is also kind of flat. They don't really have the same command of the mix in the same way. I think Brazy Da Bo is a slightly more creative MC in terms of his wordplay, but I think Awon has a little bit more structure and at least in terms of multi-syllabic compound rhyming. But as a whole, it's good. I won't call it great, but it is genuinely good. There's a lot of rap like this, though, just adjacent to the mainstream. And while this will absolutely win over a certain old school hip hop head, I do wish there was a little bit more flair, this album took a little bit more chances, or there were some greater differentiating factors. So, very solid 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. But if you've heard stuff like this before, don't say I didn't warn you. Yeah, this was one of those acts I was planning on doing a full review on until I gave it my 9th or 10th listen, and then I figured I really have to put them here. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Gold, they're more of, well, it's kind of hard to say. They technically get called a post-punk act, but I honestly wouldn't think that's entirely apropos. Basically, a lot of their sound seems almost rooted in black metal, especially with the tremolo guitars fleshing out a lot of the background of their mix. And while the drumming is more rhythmic and doom metal-esque, a lot of the vocals are a little bit more poppy or more pop-inflected. They're cleaner, they're brighter, the female singer is actually quite prominent in the mix. And while there are points where these songs get a little bit more cacophonous, more often than not, they're more spare in order to focus a lot more on the vocals. And really, when you take a look at the content, that kind of makes sense, because there is a very strong, very transgressive side of feminist theory that runs through a lot of these songs. They're intended to shock and get under the skin of their audiences, and yeah, there's a couple here that absolutely do so. So I can see if you're trying to draw a parallel with maybe Savages or Chelsea Wolfe, there's definitely some common ground there. It is some creepy stuff. And I wish I liked it more. That's the other thing. I have gone through this album so many times just trying to get a good handle on where I think they would fall, what genre, what style, but ultimately I keep coming back to the fact that while this album is probably their tightest to date, there are a lot of loose ends and structural issues that I kind of think hurts the band longer term. For one, the bass has absolutely none of the presence that it really needs to sound a little bit more visceral and punchy, really add that coursing foundation to a fair number of the songs. Honestly, this is one of those projects that I really do wish was heavier, had a little bit more grit and metal presence to it, because as it is, I like the black metal textures, but I wish there was some more gristle underneath them. Similar situation for the vocals. I wish they were a little bit more guttural, or at least leaning into our female singer's lower end a little bit more effectively. I think she can make a lot out of that, and the lead-off song, He Is Not, is probably the best example of that. And as for the content, yeah, I like the principle, I like the idea, but the very mantra-esque style that specifically comes through in a lot of the hooks, it's not really my thing. Again, if they're trying to go for cleaner vocals in order to attract more of a pop-leaning audience, just maybe bring in some of those black metal textures to try to rope them in, I see the appeal, but you kind of wish that there was a little bit more hook and song structure to these pieces. And really, the content, I wouldn't say the poetry is as detailed or visceral as Chelsea Wolfe, or really as striking and potent and nuanced as you would otherwise get from someone like Savages. Overall, I don't think it's bad by any stretch of the mind. It's in the right path. I certainly get the more artistic side that comes through with this group, but it's also one that I kind of struggle with, especially when you consider the album starts to really lose steam near the end and starts to slow down, and it's just not quite as interesting as I wish it was. I think the principle and intent is really strong here, but the execution needs to be tightened up. I like the formula, I like the idea, but a little bit more frenetic, a little bit more hooky, or actually hook-driven probably will help them, and do something with the bass grooves, add something there. But as it is, this is good. I can see there being a really significant audience, especially if you like that gothic post-punk side of things, and atmospherically, I think there's a lot of potential here, so solid 7 out of 10, absolutely worth your time, but don't set your expectations too high. That's all I'm saying.
We bring it right back. Honestly, it's better like that. I know we've been falling off track. Bring it right back. I just let the time out pass. We don't gotta take it too fast.
You know, this is the second time Khalid has shown up on the trailing edge for me, and that's basically because every time I try to sit down and draft a review to come out with any of his albums, I'm just left without a lot to say about him. Yeah, I think he's got a great voice. I think there's a lot of talent behind this kid. But the problem I keep running into is that once I say that, I keep encountering things that just are not flattering his more organic tone. Last time around, the grooves just didn't really coalesce, and it was a little bit more of a sleepy project. And there is a bit more momentum this time around. The problem is a lot of the grooves are a lot more stiff and synth-inflected, and that just does not fit for him. You want to expect with this sort of organic tone a little bit more looseness, and that doesn't really happen. That's what frustrates me about the guy. Now, granted, there are a few more standouts than I think the last time around, that just a little bit sharper hooks, but that's made up for by writing that's just not all that interesting. I don't know, by the Sun City EP, he was doubling down on this really good organic groove section that I think gave him a lot of credit, but here, it's not bad. It's certainly pleasant. It certainly goes on a little bit too long, but in order to cultivate a vibe, I see how it could work. But again, I think he runs into a similar problem that Anderson .Paak had on Oxnard, in which he gets some synth tones that might have some vibrancy, but the grooves are a little bit too regimented and stiff to complement an organic tone that doesn't easily fit within a lot of those tighter synth grooves. He's just not as tight as a singer, and I think that's the big issue. Overall, though, it's good. I'm not gonna go back to it, though. Maybe 1 or 2 songs are okay. We'll see what gets released as a single. Light 6 out of 10. If you're a fan, you've already heard it. Otherwise, you don't need to bother.
This admiration of mutilation, my isolation, my isolation.
You know what? Maybe it's too much to ask for certain bands to resume a sound that actually works for them. I get why they pivoted a couple years back with Tell Me I'm Pretty. I really do. And I even see why, because that sort of desaturated Brian Burton-esque tone, it has an appeal, but it's not interesting. And at this point, if Cage the Elephant is going to double back into that sound and then kind of have half measures whether or not they're going to bring back any actual real distortion or songs that are remotely interesting, it'll probably do well for them, but it's not something I will go back to. It does get a little bit better on the back half when they bring in some elements that are a little bit more arranged and have a little bit more bombast to them. But beyond that, I just can't really support it. Light 6 out of 10. And even then, it's just not interesting enough to talk about. Let's move on.
I found out love has to be soft to be strong.
You know, I remember the era when she was called Marina and the Diamonds, and she came out with the Family Jewels, and it was so colorful, it was so in your face, there was so much potential, and she had such a unique voice, and I really liked it. And then Electra Heart happened. It was a misstep, but she would recover on Fruit, and now it's almost a decade later, and we've got this double album of generally forgettable mainstream pop pablum that's just not really doing it for me. I kind of get the approach in the production where you're going to desaturate so much of it in order to focus everything on her unique vocal timbre, but that also serves to suck away so much of the melody and not make it all that interesting. And the writing is sadly not punching above either. There's a couple moments. I think the closer is actually really nice in emphasizing how softness and vulnerability can lead to strength. I think it's a good theme. And honestly, if she had emphasized some greater thematic connections, then I could have seen this being workable. But as a double album, it's way too long. A lot of the songs sound way too close to each other, emphasizing percussion over melody. It's not nearly as distinctive, even as when Aurora went off and did her most recent 2-part project. There's a lot more tones and unique textures than what Marina delivers here, and it just doesn't feel as unique or special. So yeah, I hate to say it, but there's kind of a reason that so many people have already forgotten about it. 5 out of 10 for the fans, but the fans deserve better. Hell, in terms of Marina's career, she probably deserves better too. You know, I was actually planning on making this a full review. I was kind of kicking myself that I didn't give Tim Hecker's Konoyo a full review last year, and I figured with Onoyo this year, which is very much a sister, darker album to that, I could do so, and then I listened to it a couple of different times. And look, ambient albums are always difficult to criticize in this specific vein, especially considering it's pulling a lot of similar elements from Konoyo with some of the Japanese strings and some of the darker, thicker, a little bit more jagged percussion progressions. But at the same time, it's just not as interesting. It's not as wild, it's not as experimental. The melodic shifts are a little bit more underwhelming. Some of the percussion elements are genuinely imposing, and I think there's an okay, kind of uneasy flow to the album. It's definitely playing to a darker vibe, and I can respect that. But at the end of the day, I'm just kind of flat on it. It's fine, it's good. I think to a lot of diehard Tim Hecker fans, he's done a lot better. It's not any Rave Death 1972 or anything like that. It's not Virgins, but it's not his worst either. It generally goes down okay. I'm thinking a strong 6 out of 10. For this sort of ambient music, I'll admit that I am not the biggest connoisseur, but I've heard worse. If you're a fan, you've probably already heard it. If not, what the hell, give it a listen.
I learned just who I was and who I was in that old truck.
Well, this is one of the situations where my history with Thomas Rhett, it's arguably more interesting than the album that he actually put out. No joke, I was planning a full review going into this album at length, but going through the 16 tracks we get here, because my god, this thing is way too long. The problem is there's just so little to say about this, because it's exactly the same sort of country, well, not really country, more pop that's masquerading itself as country, more of a country costume, and it's all mainly focused on a bunch of very lightweight, breezy, basic love songs. And you know what? At this point, there's nothing to really say about that. Thomas Rhett has specifically positioned himself to play to his audience and demographic. And the fact that I'm not in that, well, it doesn't give me a lot to really say about this. I might not like it, but my sister's gonna like it. When my sister goes and sees Thomas Rhett live, she'll appreciate it. But as for me, look, as I said this on Twitter, whenever Thomas Rhett tries to go for this pop thing where he's crossbreeding Adam Levine and Andy Grammer, it's not only uninteresting, it's really sloppily produced. The grooves are not there. It doesn't feel organic. Honestly, the more country he goes, the better off he sounds. And sadly, this album, it does not go as country as it really should. Now, let me stress this. It's not as bad as Tangled Up was, if only because it's not nowhere near as badly produced, and the hooks are marginally more competent, but at the same time, you're not getting a song as good as Marry Me or even Die a Happy Man. I really don't see any songs here standing out as obvious singles, and that could be a real problem for Thomas Rhett going forward, given how much he coasts on being a singles act, and he kind of has to be, given a lot of this production. But no, this is not all that interesting. The audience will probably like it, but I certainly don't. A light 5 out of 10. It'll serve who it's meant to serve, and that person's not me.
Everyone says to me, Missy, you're so strong. But what if I wanna be?
You know, I bet there are some of you who might be surprised that this is not getting a full-length review, especially given how much critical acclaim this album has received, and along with it, the fact that I've become more accustomed to hardcore punk in the past year or so, thanks to Resonators. And that's all true, and again, I do like this new album from Mannequin Pussy. It's a little bit slower, a little bit more drawn out, slightly more methodical, even though you definitely have those short bursts of noisy, very aggressive, very fuzzed out hardcore punk, just with a couple other songs that are a little bit slower, a little bit more methodical, be able to tap into those quieter emotions that I think Mannequin Pussy really sticks the landing with. I guess for me is that this is a good album, but it's not really a great one, and it doesn't give me a ton to say. I appreciate the aggression, but I will say that in the previous two albums, that aggression was more focused and more abrasive, brought a little bit more of those textures to bear. And while they were going in a slightly more indie rock direction, it's a very conventional indie rock direction. There's nothing here that I haven't heard from Lydia Loveless in the past, for instance, or other punks that are slightly adjacent to that lane. And the writing, while being good, while being emotive, while being expressive, it never really stepped over the line for me into true greatness. There are a few moments that get there. I think Drunk 2 is a phenomenal little song, especially in realizing that you don't want to have to be hard all the time, and embracing that sort of vulnerability is a good thing. And I think the level of dramatic range their frontwoman has is impressive. But I don't know, it kind of runs out of steam near the end. I think the album, it's got its most aggressive and forthright moments at the end, but they don't quite hit with the same impact as the best cuts do. It's a bit of an uneven project as a whole. Again, the writing doesn't quite jump off the page as much to really grab me and pull me in. And I do think some of the groove sections are a little bit underwhelming, and For as aggressive and abrasive as it is, you will have heard noise rock and indie rock and riot grrrl and punk acts in this lane do this sound before, and this fits in within the pack and the upper end of the pack, but it doesn't really transcend it. As such, for me, solid 7 out of 10. It's absolutely worth a listen, but again, good subject matter, good quality material. If this is up your alley, you'll certainly like it, but just didn't quite have that additional spark to get over the edge. That's all.